Where are we now? How have we gotten here?
Right. I think that we can very broadly, speak about two periods in the war. The first period, which is the first sort of 6 weeks, is the period when the Russians move into Ukraine. They move in very fast. They sense that things are going wrong. Ukraine has been shelling Donbass. They know all about this kind of planning that's going on by the United States. I mean, they have they're able to read the rooms. They could see what was coming out of Washington. So they could see that things were beginning to deteriorate badly. They heard what was said at the Munich Security Conference and all that. They said to themselves, look, or at least Putin said, we don't know the whole story of the debates that are going on in Moscow at that time. But they're saying we can't get a deal with the Americans. Biden is not to be trusted. He says one thing, he does something else. The Europeans are weak. They go along with whatever the Americans tell them. They're intimidated by the Americans. They're intimidated by some of their own hardliners, the British, the Baltic states, and the Poles. So let's see if we send our troops into Ukraine, whether just possibly we might be able to cut a deal with the Ukrainians. Zelensky, after all, was appointed on a peace platform. He was elected on a platform of implementing the Minsk agreement. He comes from the Russian-speaking part of Ukraine. Perhaps we can reason with him. So they move in, they bring their troops to Kiev. They make no attempt to capture Kiev. And that's an important point to understand. And they enter into negotiations. And most of March is taken up with negotiations. And at the end of March, we have a draft agreement. And it's a very simple agreement. It says, Crimea, Donbass, we accept that they're not going to be administered by Ukraine. Their final status is not to be determined now. That's for another day. Ukraine stays out of NATO. There will be certain security guarantees extended to Ukraine by Russia, by the Western powers. But, Ukraine will retain its sovereignty independence. Now, we're now told by some Ukrainians that was never real, that the Ukrainians weren't being sincere about those negotiations. They were just stringing the Russians along. What we do know is that the Russians did believe that they had a deal, and they pulled back their forces from Kiev. They did all kinds of reorganizations, things of that kind. And then, of course, the Ukrainians went back on the deal when it was almost signed and sealed. And all the evidence, to my mind, the stronger evidence, the comments by people like Prime Minister Bennett of Israel, President Erdogan of Turkey, all of them point to the fact that the British and the Americans and hardliners within Kiev deliberately sabotaged this deal. So we then have this period when the Russians are saying, what exactly are we going to do? Our forces aren't constituted to wage a long war in Ukraine. We haven't got the numbers to win a war quickly in Ukraine. And come the autumn, they find that they're heavily outnumbered by the Ukrainians. The Ukrainians have been rearmed with Western weapons. They're going on the attack in places like Kharkiv, in Kherson region, these famous offensives that we're hearing about. Ukrainians suffer enormous losses over these offensives, but they do recover ground. So the Russians say, well, in that case, we have got to start thinking about waging this war seriously as a war. And that is what they have started to do. They mobilized 300,000 men. They brought in 80,000 volunteers. They built up the Wagner organization. They built up these enormous fortifications. They mobilized the military industrial complex in Russia to start churning out tanks and machines and bombs and cruise missiles. They started to strike at Ukrainian infrastructure. And suddenly, now, over the last couple of weeks, we've had a situation where in the West, we go from a situation of Ukraine being on the brink of victory and about to recapture Crimea to worries about big Russian offensive coming in the spring, and can Ukraine hold out? So this has been a major shift in Russian policy. But what it shows to you is the underlying point that Alex and I have been making right through this war, which is that the strategic initiative at all times has remained with the Russians. It is they who have been deciding how the war is fought. In the first weeks, they decided that they'd play it small and light because they were aiming for a peace deal. Now they've decided to fight the war in a different way. They're going heavy. And I'm going to say frankly that, we hear about dribbles of tanks being sent by the West. We hear lots of talk about fighter jets. It's not going to be anywhere near enough or come anywhere near enough soon to make a difference. And I think the Pentagon, for example, knows it.
Yeah, I mean, they're saying something like they're going to send around, say, 300 tanks, give or take. That's what the West is going to put together. But then you listen to what Shoigu said the other day, and he said that Russia in January, according to Shoigu, the defense minister, he said that they destroyed around 300 tanks in just 1 month. And is this what they're providing Ukraine is not? It's not going to make the difference. And with fighter jets, Poland is now coming out and saying, well, we're not going to give up our F-16s until other EU member states give up their F-16s. Belgium said, we don't have planes to give. Everyone was going crazy about tanks just a week ago. Now no one is talking about tanks. Actually, I think Newsweek or CNN ran an article just the other day saying that, the tanks are going to probably be too heavy for Ukraine. So, I mean, the West is working on a hope strategy. They have no plan. They're making it up as they go along. The only thing that they want is escalation. They can't admit that this is over. They can't admit that it's time to get to the negotiating table, to save thousands of lives, to perhaps save the territory that remains as Ukraine, to remain Ukraine going forward. And instead, their knee-jerk reaction is escalation. But how are they going to escalate? The UK, there are reports that the UK pretty much has no weapons anymore. And Sunak, and I think Sunak yesterday when he said everything is on the table and Boris Johnson was talking about giving 100 Typhoon fighter jets, I think Sunak thought, you know what, I'll just come out with those statements. And when I make those statements, then all of the Europeans are just going to come and say, yeah, we'll give over our F-16s and we'll go give over our planes. No, they didn't give over anything because they sense that Ukraine is losing. And everyone sees what's happening now in Bakhmut and in the Donbass. I mean, it's there. There's this big cauldron encirclement that is forming. And there's thousands of Ukrainian troops that are going to be trapped in this encirclement. And when Bakhmut falls, then you're just going to see a chain reaction of the entire east of Ukraine, one city after another, Kramatorsk, Slavyansk, they're all going to start to fall. And then we may switch to some sort of maneuver warfare instead of the slow grind. Things may switch and things may get more dynamic, but they're always going to switch in favor of the Russians. And just going back to what Alexander said with how the war started and where it ended up, I look at the war as a war between Russia and Ukraine up until the end of March, April, a conflict, and then Boris Johnson rolls into Kiev, and the war becomes a conflict between Russia and this proxy state. I mean, it really was two conflicts. And it was Boris Johnson that came in and somehow all the dynamics changed. And it went from a conflict between Russia and Ukraine to this proxy war between NATO and Russia, where they're escalating consistently. But even Stoltenberg yesterday, when he was meeting with Blinken, said, but we're not a party to the war. But we're not a party to the war, NATO. And it's very insulting, I think, for a lot of people to listen to Stoltenberg talk about escalation and regime change in Russia. taking Crimea and striking out at Moscow. It's interesting to hear all these comments, and then he says we're not a party to the war.
Can I just very quickly add on the British topic? Alex talks about 100 Typhoon fighters. If Boris Johnson got his way, that is the entire Royal Air Force. We have 100 Typhoon fighters. I mean, I'm British. I mean, I should know. And in fact, a British cabinet minister has been briefing the media here, and he used an expletive, which I'm not going to repeat on this program for the tender ears of our viewers, but he used an expletive and said, "What fighters? We haven't got any to give." So, I mean, it's just, they say one thing, but the military clearly are briefing the cabinet in a completely different way. But again, it's very difficult now to get off this escalation escalator once you get on, because of course you will look completely ridiculous and weak if you do. And that's the danger of the situation we're in now.
Yeah, it feels like Russia, they talk about turning the tide. You know, in my opinion, when things began, in the United States decided it was going to go all in militarily with whatever it could. As things played out, even as they were talking about Ukrainian victories, the summer and the fall, these offensives, it was still a reality that this wasn't the kind of war that the United States was generally used to waging. And generally, they would, they talk about the M1 Abrams tanks being so effective in Iraq. Well, Iraq is not Russia, and certainly deciding to fight Russia through Ukraine was categorically different than anything the United States had participated in prior to that. So it's always seemed to be an inevitability that the U.S. and NATO would run into a pretty hard brick wall, and it seems like now it's happening. Now are these dominoes falling, and I'm wondering what you two think. Where you two think this is going to go on the battlefield? Alex, you mentioned that you feel like their dominoes are going to fall after Bakhmut. And we've been hearing all these reports about Russia's offensive is coming. And you also have Kiev in this really unstable place politically, where you have now the defense minister is no longer the defense minister, Mr. Reznikov. And that comes after lots of political changes happening within Kiev's internal political institutions. So, I mean, where is this going to go, given that, as you said, Alexander, it looks pretty ridiculous to now for the United States, given its reputation, all of the huge hubris it's been throwing around about Russia and about how it's, winning a war of democracy over autocracy, and that it's with Ukraine. Alex, you've talked about this a lot. With Ukraine to the end, right? We're never abandoning their man Zelensky, but it doesn't seem like this can stay the same if Russia is going to continue to pursue its objectives and succeed in them. That's just how it feels right now, in the relative quiet in Washington around this, especially where I reside, not Washington D.C. proper, but in the United States. Feels like there are more worries than maybe what the whole collective West is letting on about this situation.
Well, I think you've actually put your finger on it, because I think in Europe we have, to such an extent now, lost strategic autonomy that there is really no effective debate going on. I mean, the only person who sometimes mumbles words that might imply some kind of a debate amongst the top leaders. I mean, there's people like Orban in Hungary who are openly skeptical. But, these are marginal players, however much, you may, look up to them or appreciate them. Orban is not a major decision maker in Europe. But the only one who mumbles sometimes about, we got to try and talk to the Russians, find some kind of security arrangements and that kind of thing, is Macron. But Macron, at the same time, is one of the most extreme hardliners. So he has this, double-edged thing. He's the one who's piling the weapons, more weapons than anyone else, into Ukraine, infuriating, by the way, the Germans, who feel that he's pulling deeper into something they don't want to get into, and annoying the Russians too. And by the way, exasperating the French military. But we got no debate here. But in the United States, one senses one you do. Now, there have been three very big reports, each one following the other in the United States. And they all came out over a period of around 10 days. One was from the RAND Corporation, which is the military's, the Pentagon's think tank. And it said, there's no pathway to Ukrainian victory. Ukraine cannot win this war militarily. And the best possible outcome for Ukraine is a prolonged war. And a prolonged war is contrary to the best interests of the United States. The United States is weakening faster in some ways than the Russians are. We'll come to that in a moment. And over and above and beyond that, there's always the risk the Russians will win outright. And there's also a real risk, perhaps not a great one, but it is there, that this will escalate out of control and we could end up in a World War III type situation, which is not in our interests at all. So the RAND says, we don't want a prolonged war. We have to find a diplomatic solution. You have the CSIS, which is the military industrial complex's think tank. They're coming along. They're saying our stocks of weapons are becoming depleted. We need at least 5 years, perhaps 10 years, to sort out production issues. We can't do that in the timescales that people are talking about. We run a serious risk that in terms of certain types of important weapons, Patriot missiles, HIMARS, the big HIMARS rockets, those kind of things, which we might need if there's a conflict somewhere else, perhaps the South China Sea. We'll come to that later in the program. We can't send all of those to Ukraine. We've got to husband our strength until we sorted out the problems with our military industrial system. And then the third report, the most intriguing of all, from the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, speaking for the financial community in New York and Washington, for the Fed. We all know the Fed is very much influential with the IMF, the Treasury Department is, all of these entities are. Well, it says, well, actually, the sanctions haven't succeeded. Russia's economy is going to grow in 2023. It's not going to collapse in 2023. It's going to be bigger in 2023 than it was in 2022. So any idea that we're going to collapse the Russians and force them to peace, it isn't going to work. So you had these three big reports. You have Mike Rogers, the chair of the House Armed Services Committee. He's briefed by the Pentagon. The Pentagon have told him Ukraine isn't going to be able to recapture Crimea anytime soon. In fact, anytime soon basically means never. He comes out and says, we've got to find some pathway to a diplomatic solution because this war has to end by the summer. That's what he says. And one senses that there is this accumulating group in the United States who are talking these things. But the center of policy are the four people that Alex identified: Biden, Blinken, Sullivan, and Nuland. And of course, they are massively ideologically and politically invested in this project. Now, I was listening to Biden's State of the Union address. I both watched it, unendurable agony that was. I then read it. He didn't actually say very much about foreign policy, but he did use these two deadly sentences, which are, if you like, the great mantras at the moment of the neocons. With Ukraine, we will support Ukraine as long as it takes. Committing the United States, in other words, to a prolonged war, exactly what Rand and the Pentagon are saying he shouldn't do. And with China, we will work with the Chinese on matters that are in our own interest and compete against the Chinese on everything else. And that's also there. And of course, not cooperate with the Chinese on matters that are in their interest, only cooperate with them on matters which are in our own interest. So these are the two neocon mantras. And even though, and it's a sign, I think, of the pressure that's now on and the debate within Washington that is now on, he avoided saying much about foreign policy. He was very careful to insert those two sentences, or rather his speechwriters were, in what he said. And it's a signal. It's a signal that the president and this team that Alex identified, they may not have a clear plan. They may not know quite what they can do, but they are not going to reverse policy easily. There would have to be enormous political pressure on them to change direction.
Yeah, I don't know how this conflict winds down when you have these four individuals running the show in DC. One thing that the Hirsch article, made very, very clear is going back to that article, is that these four individuals are absolutely making all the decisions, and they are absolutely emotionally invested in this. I mean, this is beyond, I think, even national interest or just U.S. foreign policy or bad decision making. All the decisions they're making are emotional decisions, it seems, and they've got some sort of axe to grind with Russia. They've made it their personal goal and mission in life to destroy Russia, to dismember Russia, to balkanize Russia, to get regime change in Russia. That was the original plan. They thought 3 weeks of economic shock and awe, and the Putin government's going to collapse. We're going to go in there, and everything's going to be just like it was in the 1990s with Yeltsin. And maybe we'll break it up into 5 different countries just to make sure that we don't have another Putin, surprising us and becoming president. But they're absolutely emotionally invested in this. So I think until Biden is addressed, I don't have another way to explain it. Until Biden and his team is addressed, I don't see how they can pull back from this.